I'm Abby from Cornell University, and I'm going to be talking about how small food businesses can be compliant with FSMA. So last week, I gave an overview of regulations that are relevant to small food businesses kind of generally, but today I'm going to get into the details on FSMA because it applies to the majority of these small food businesses briefly after kind of like recapping what we touched on the last time. So again, you remember by small, what I mean here is a business that makes less than $1 million in food a year, because according to the preventive controls rule of FSMA, that's the point at which small food businesses are eligible for qualified exemptions from the rule. So this webinar is a training series. It's supported in part by the USDA. We've integrated it with some COVID-19 preparedness content for a few reasons. One, because of the disruption to food production that the pandemic has caused, and because it's so important, now more than ever, to produce food safely so that we're not having additional people have to seek medical attention from foodborne illnesses, and because recalls or food safety violations stress an already kind of heavily taxed food system. And so FSMA compliance can support that. Moreover, a lot of the practices that align with FSMA compliance, right? Things like sanitation, employee health and hygiene, those things are also methods for controlling the spread of coronavirus within food facilities. So kind of killing two birds with one stone here with getting these practices up and going. So finally, the current disruption in consumer purchasing habits also means that a lot of small food businesses are really considering ways of diversifying or adapting to these new patterns. So restaurants are thinking about bottling dressings to sell retail. Some produce growers are thinking about how to increase value addition in products. So offering kind of FSMA compliance guidance is a way of supporting businesses in the face of uncertainty too. So last time we mentioned several regulations are potentially relevant to small food processors. Today we're focusing on the preventive controls, or the PC rule, within FSMA. You'll recall that the FDA and USDA both regulate different types of products. USDA is primarily meat and poultry, but that the preventive controls rule, which we're focusing on, applies to the majority of FDA regulated products, but that the people you might most often see in your facility are state inspectors who might even be performing inspections on behalf of the FDA against that PC rule. FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, it includes different types of rules. So if you're a produce grower, you might already know the produce safety rule. There's rules for animal feed, but we are talking about the preventive controls for human foods rule, which covers food processing. So that rule is sometimes called the PC rule for short. It includes 7 subparts here, A through G. If you sell more than $1 million, you're subject to all the subparts. And additionally, you have to take a 2.5-day class called the Preventive Controls for Qualified Individuals. That course focuses on subparts C and G, and those are the most intense, most document intense parts of the rule. They include the requirements for the written hazard analysis, and depending on your hazard analysis, written preventive control plans and associated documentation. So if you are small and you're eligible for a size-based qualified exemption, so you sell less than $1 million a year, you are eligible for exemptions from these 2 subparts, right? That's what you get. But even if you do sell less than $1 million, you are still exempt from all the you are still subject to all the other subparts. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of what you are subject to, and then next time I'm going to be talking about how to document that you don't have to do all that other stuff, right? So we're going to talk about documenting qualified exemptions in the final presentation. So notably, of these subparts, subpart B here, which you are subject to, lists good manufacturing practices, or GMPs. That applies to everybody, including the very small facilities. So this part of the regulation lists, it's basic sanitary practices required in food production. It should be considered really as just kind of a baseline. It's a foundation for your food safety program. And it's the same type of activities, like Betty kind of alluded to, that can help prevent the spread of COVID-19. So there are 8 key components to GMPs. I know it feels sometimes with regulations like we talk about subparts of subparts of subparts, which I totally understand. But these key components are kind of grouped by type of activities that support food safety. So at the end of my little blurb today, I'm going to talk about training requirements. So when you think about what type of training you have to do for yourself or for other food handlers whom you work with or employ, it should kind of cover these 8 topics with GMPs. Now, some of them are going to be more or less relevant to an individual employee based on their job responsibility. So we'll kind of talk through too about like what makes sense to most emphasize. So I'm going to go through kind of each of these briefly. So GMPs are kind of notoriously somewhat dry, but it won't be long. So no worries there. The best way in my experience to learn about GMPs or to teach them if you're going to train people in your facility is from examples or from like hands-on experiences within your facility. So at the end, I'm going to talk about training resources and kind of like what the options are. Okay, so for the first pillar of GMPs is personnel, which kind of specifically refers to health and hygiene. So this includes like restricting personnel with symptoms of foodborne illness from working in food handling. Now you're going to also be thinking about restricting employees with respiratory symptoms to prevent COVID spread in your facility. So that's kind of a nuance in terms of how GMPs get adapted here, like in the face of this pandemic. This section also includes practices around hand hygiene, right? How and when to wash hands, glove usage, and where employees can eat, drink, and smoke. So that holds true, right, for kind of both food safety and coronavirus. And this GMP category, right, includes aspects related to personal grooming, hair restraint, jewelry removal, and so on. That's really more food safety. And this is a big focus of food handler GMP training because kind of regardless of employee responsibilities, these are basic policies governing employee behavior. And it's a place that you might consider kind of enhancing these bare minimum practices to include social distancing, including sick employees with respiratory or temperature symptoms or exposure to other sick individuals from your facility, hand hygiene to prevent the spread of coronavirus. So the second component has to do with plant and ground maintenance. This includes making sure the land immediately surrounding your facility is well drained, free of debris. Inside the facility should have adequate lighting and have guards against glass breakage, like using shatterproof glass. The space and the equipment has to be cleanable, and appropriate routes for waste disposal have to be in place. So like in contrast to kind of the personnel topic, which applies to like everyone, all the food handlers, you can see how some of these might be job specific in terms of plant and ground maintenance. The third component here is sanitary operations. And this includes having appropriate sanitation programs in place, but also ensuring that the sanitation programs themselves don't introduce additional hazards. This is accomplished by selecting cleaning chemicals appropriate for their purpose. So if you're using it on a food contact surface, the label says it should be used on a food contact surface, and properly labeling cleaning chemicals if you, say, pull a smaller volume out of a larger container for individual use. A fourth component, equipment and utensils, kind of similarly specifies that equipment, utensils, disposable items must be protected from contamination. So both of these kind of categories are places that you can see enhancement practices to prevent the transmission of coronavirus. So for example, your current sanitation program might really focus on equipment, food contact surfaces. Now you might focus on high touch surfaces in personal or common spaces like Betty kind of touched on, door handles, refrigerator handles, desks, increased sanitation of restroom facilities, touch pads if you have like cashier pads that customers have to use. Sanitary facilities and controls dictates that there's adequate potable water, plumbing and sewage disposal, access to toilet facilities, and that hand washing stations are there and stocked and sanitary. So again, here is where you're trying to support not just food safety, but the type of hand hygiene and sanitation of these high touch surfaces and stocking hand washing supplies to prevent COVID-19 spread too. Under process controls, this is really food safety. Products must comply with FDA minimum requirements for default action levels. Products have to be stored to prevent contamination and deterioration. And this might include preventing microbial growth through processing activities like cooking or refrigeration, adjusting the pH or the water activity. This is really going to depend, obviously, on what your product and your process look like. Allergens are managed as well to protect consumers from cross-contamination. And I want to point out that, like, if you are already operating in a food facility that receives inspections from FDA or from state inspectors, you likely already have GMPs in place. So you might be curious how these kind of current GMPs or the updated GMPs associated with the preventive control rule differ from what you might have been doing before. So the kind of key area of focus that is different is this emphasis on allergen management. Allergens are controlled through labeling, right, including declaration on product statements when you have allergens as an ingredient, and they're controlled through sanitation to prevent allergen cross-contact between runs. Like if one product has an allergen and the other one doesn't, you use sanitation and scheduling to prevent cross-contact. Other practices to have in place for allergen management include procedures for receipt and storage, noting what ingredients you handle that contain allergens, segregating them in storage, and making sure that they are well labeled and clearly marked for your employees or other food handlers. So I think notably, if you produce out of a shared use kitchen or a commissary or some scenario like that, it might be worth having a conversation with the manager about strategies kind of shared among people who use that space, because it's not just up to you alone then in that case to control allergen cross contact. Okay, so those are kind of like a brief touch on GMPs. You're definitely expected, even as a small food business, to comply with each of those categories that we talked about. But kind of secondly, you also are expected to train and document training for employees on several of those components. So here I'm showing an excerpt from the relevant regulation. You can see this comes from subpart A, so right, not subpart C and G. So this is not something you're exempt from. And I want to highlight a few parts that answer the questions: who must be trained and what must they be trained in? So the first question is who? Like, who within this food business needs to be trained? Is it everyone? No, it's not necessarily everyone, but it's everyone who has responsibility for manufacturing, processing, packing, and holding food. So you can see I highlighted that in red. And if you hire a summer intern to run your Facebook page, they might not have responsibilities in those categories. But you should think broadly about who it could include. So for example, if you have someone who just receives ingredients once they are delivered, or someone who orders labels or does label printing, those people might have responsibility for allergen management. So it might be worth including them in your GMP training. The second part I have highlighted is what they are supposed to receive training in, and that is the principles of food hygiene and food safety, such as employee health and personal hygiene, which are basically GMPs, right? The stuff that we kind of talked about before. What this doesn't answer is how often you have to retrain employees. So this is a figure from some data that Erin and I collected in a survey of food processors, asking managers how often they offered retraining to employees. And we organized their responses by facility size. So you can see that the largest facilities, those with more than 30 employees, offered retraining every year, most typically, while the smallest facilities with 1 or 2 employees, though they most commonly did not require retraining at all. And according to the bare minimum letter of the law and the regulation, you do not technically have to offer retraining. But as a rule of thumb, let me strongly suggest the following, right? You can retrain if an employee's job changes. So like if they suddenly have more or different food safety responsibilities. You can retrain if you identify a problem that could be solved with training, or at a minimum, retrain once a year. This does not have to be super intense. It can be 15, 20 minutes. You hit the high points just to drive home food safety guidance. And as an example of, I mentioned retrain whenever an issue that's solvable by training is identified. Let me suggest that this current pandemic is a problem, and it really makes a lot of sense to do employee training now to drive home what you might think are basic common sense practices for hand washing, mask wearing, social distancing. But I strongly encourage you, for a lot of the social reasons that Betty touched on, drive home the messaging. Do not assume that people know or agree or will do it if you don't kind of deliver consistent plans. So where are sources of GMP trainings? So if you or someone who works in your facility possess the skills to offer good GMP training, that can be some of the potentially best real world examples for your employees. But if you or someone there are not comfortable or confident in doing that, there are also resources through university extension, such as this course, Betty can probably direct you to other resources, or Aaron, or Steve, depending on what state you're in, and online classes. So FDA, for example, subcontracted Cornell to develop an online one. This is just an example. Some states offer their own state-specific example. I know Ohio has one. I'm sure the other states probably do too. So there's different modules. You can go in, take them at your own pace, or do it all at once. And they kind of follow the same outline as the GMP reg itself. Okay, so GMPs noted in subpart B. I just want to wrap up today by talking about associated documentation. So we established that the regulation says that all people engaged in manufacturing, packing, holding of food must receive training in the principles of food hygiene and food safety, including the importance of employee health and hygiene. Note that this does not say that the individual can be qualified through experience, right? This is like sometimes what people try to do. It has to be training, right? There has to be training performed, and the training has been documented. So this might be a little different than what you have previously done. But when we talk about record keeping to support this training, just know it doesn't have to be anything super fancy. So something as simple as, a paper at the top of the record, you name it, employee training log, write the name of your company, you list all of the people who work there, and by each name, you list the date they were trained, what they were trained on, and a signature or initials of the supervisor. So it could look like this, right? Just as described, but there's no specified format. You're welcome to adapt this. You'll have access to these slides later. You don't have to have a certificate from a training program, but you're welcome to include that too, if you'd like. And for example, if you have a training log like this, you can definitely include this webinar series as kind of an element of professional development within that training documentation. All right, so zooming back out to the higher view of the regulation. We talked about some portions of what food businesses that are small are subject to, and I'm going to wrap up next time with kind of additional requirements to document your qualified exemptions. So to support that you do not have to do all of the written hazard analysis programs involved in subpart C and G. But to finish up today, again, as you've heard before, and as I mentioned last time, these are uncertain times. It's useful now to have kind of a what they call a growth mindset, right? To see this as an opportunity to reevaluate kind of your business, get plans in place for moving forward from here, kind of thinking about how to address regulatory compliance. I know a lot of businesses are even doing some like capital structural investments and changes because they're out of production right now. So I think that's kind of smart. If you're in production, it's definitely important to think through how to enhance GMPs to prevent COVID spread among your employees. Think through continuity planning, who can do different job functions if someone gets sick. Happy to answer any questions about GMP enhancement for COVID-19 preparedness and or regulatory compliance during the breakout. We'll be talking more at the next and final webinar. So look forward to answering your questions.